Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 4 of the fiscal year 2021 CSBG annual reporting webinar series. Before we get started, I want to provide a few housekeeping rules. We have muted everyone upon entry and ask that everyone remains muted throughout the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A pod. We'll try to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. For any questions we are unable to answer, we'll provide additional guidance in future webinars. The chat function is also available, but we will primarily focus on answering questions submitted through the Q&A pod. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the OCS CSBG webinars page. I'm joined today by Muska Kamran and Paige Milson of the National Association for State Community Services Programs, also known as NASCAS. And my name is Monique Alcantara. I am a management and program analyst here in the Office of Community Services. Today's webinar is really focused on the state's role in reviewing the data submitted by CSBG eligible entities in modules 2 and module 4, known as the eligible entity expenditures, capacity, and resources, or as I like to refer to it as the eligible entities administration of CSBG, or module 2, and the individual and family level, or module 4. We'll also go through some resources, contacts, and again, we'll have the Q&A and remind you of some upcoming webinars and presentations. So the state's role in reviewing data. The SMART forms aren't just for agencies, they are a tool that is for the states. And just to go over the requirement again, as is written into the Act. Each state shall annually prepare and submit to the Secretary a report on the measured performance of the state and the eligible entities in the state. And with that, we really do want to make sure that we're changing the way that we think about collecting and reviewing data. So it's important to change this current mindset that we have of we're just collecting data for reporting purposes to we collect data to help manage and support the agency's programs and services and determine if we make a difference in our clients' lives and in their communities. And we also want to consider it as we review the data to ensure agencies are reporting correctly and ultimately fulfilling their missions. As a brief reminder, the fiscal year 2021 CSBG annual reports, a complete submission includes submission of all 3 reports, the CSBG annual report, CSBG CARES annual report, and CSBG disaster supplemental annual report as applicable. We do review these as one report. So we are expecting everyone to submit these together. All the reports are due on March 31st, 2022. There will not be an extension or additional 30 days for the CARES and disaster as there was last year. And these 3 reports are referred to collectively as a CSBG annual report. And just want to remind everyone that the reporting requirements remain the same as last year. So we didn't really update any of the forms or anything of that nature. And today we're really going to focus on what the state should be looking at, again, while they're reviewing modules 2 and 4. That being said, I want to also remind you guys what is a complete module 2 and 4. During last year's submission, we did realize that there may have been some confusion about this. So a complete submission of modules 2 and 4 includes uploading all XMLs for all reporting eligible entities. This means that all XMLs must be uploaded successfully and saved. And we'll go over that a little bit more in our OLDC webinar next week. And it must include any comments that may provide additional clarity to your data. Including comments is optional, but we found that if you provide some pre-comments as we're reviewing the data, it does help us give some clarity and background to what you guys are submitting to OCS. And then just another reminder that you must upload XMLs for all reporting eligible entities. And we expect any reporting eligible entities to be those entities that were reported in the CSBG state plan or the CARE state plan or in the disaster supplemental applications for stage 1 and stage 2. If a CSBG eligible entity was designated after October 1st, 2020, we do ask that you upload a blank XML if they're not reporting any final data. And for CARES and disaster, for any entities that did not expend funds or decline those funds, we still ask that you upload a blank XML. This is just the state confirming to OCS that that eligible entity is not reporting. And then after you've uploaded all the XMLs for your modules 2 and 4 submission, we do ask that you submit the state level form for each module. And lastly, House report of no CARES and disaster funds were expended. For CARES, describe those challenges within Module 1, Section B, under the progress update of your goals and or lessons learned, which is B.3. And under disaster supplemental, all states should have obligated all Stage 1 and Stage 2 funds by September 30th. So we're really hoping that there are no blank forms for disaster supplemental unless you declined those funds. And for eligible entities, if the eligible entity declined, then the state, you're still required to submit on their behalf, and then note that information in Module 2, 8.6, and then upload. And again, a blank module for XML can be uploaded. And with that, I will pass it on to Muska.
Thanks so much, Monique. And I wanted to thank OCS for having us for this webinar and for doing this incredible webinar series every year, because I know I find it to be super helpful to gearing us all up for submission every year. So as Monique said, the state offices are the ones that are submitting the data in OLDC to OCS, right? So we are, as state offices, we are the ones that are actually submitting our grantee information to OCS. And so it is incredibly important that we review that data to make sure that it is, as solid as possible at the point that we submit it into OLDC. So I really want to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, to go over some tips that you can consider as you review the data that you get from your agency. So I know we've talked a lot about smart forms, and I know that not every state uses smart forms. The majority of the states use smart forms, and they do have inherent logic checks built into them. If you are a state using a state system, you may have built those logic checks as well. And if you haven't built those logic checks, right, then you could always reference tools like this PowerPoint or other tools that we have to go through some of the things that smart forms would help states go through. So at the end of the day, right, whether you're using smart forms, whether you are using a state system, how are you supposed to review this data? And first and foremost, the easiest piece of this is to review each module for completeness and accuracy. And I know that seems really basic, but a lot of what we see, and sometimes what we flag in review memos, is just making sure, if the third column of the NPI was left blank, right? Was that on purpose? We just want to make sure that the agency meant that meant, that zero achieved that NPI, or was that just a mishap on their end? And maybe they meant to actually put data in there, right? So completeness is really sort of one of the most basic checks we can do here. There are lots of areas in the report that sort of build off of each other. So like, for example, if an agency reports agency capacity funds, they should then describe their agency capacity activities, right? So you just want to make sure that the form is complete in the way that it's meant to be completed. If you are using smart forms, or if you are using a state system that has built in those logic checks, you're probably going to see error and warning messages and color coding. Those are going to be extremely helpful. I know at the federal review level, that's primarily what we focus our review on, which is looking at, the sort of red flags that show up just for completeness and just, logic errors and stuff like that. So a lot of those errors and warnings that pop up, that is predominantly what the review is focused on. So that is an excellent starting point to focus on for your state review when you're reviewing the data that you get from your local agencies. We do have some checklists, which we will pinpoint you to at the end of this presentation, but those checklists for modules 2 and 4, and then there's also a checklist for module 3, but those checklists, again, will guide you through exactly all of the things that at the national level we take a look at. So those are the exact same things at the state level you should be taking a look at with your agencies, and it does include, some of the logic checks that I mentioned that are built in the smart forms or your vendors may have built, but it also looks into things that go beyond the smart form, right? Because there's only so much you can capture in programming and coding in a form. A big part of the review process is just needing that human lens to take a look at the data, right? Like the form just reads formulas, right? Your system just reads formulas, but there are certain things that when we just take a look at it, we can just tell, I feel like, maybe this part isn't making sense quite, or maybe I need to ask more information here to figure out what this means, right? So some of those things are like comparing services to outcomes, right? Making sure that they're telling, a, a story together. It doesn't have to be the same exact story, right? But they should be telling a story together. Same thing in comparing outcomes and services to demographics. Those are not checks that are built in the form, but those are things that we should be taking a look at, again, just to make sure that there's consistency across the story that we're telling here. And you should be comparing for reported demographics, even to census data sometimes. We've definitely seen instances where agencies have reported a significantly higher number than the total people that lived in their service area. And there can be many reasons why that ends up being the case. Again, we're not expecting the data to be 100% perfect because we know there are barriers and challenges to getting that perfect data, but you should at least ask when you notice something like that, right? Just to make sure that it wasn't something as simple as data being fat fingered in, right? Or, we accidentally put in one extra digit than we meant to. Just really easy checks like that. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So with that as our general framework for how you should approach the review for all the modules, we're going to go into the second module, which Monique said is the administration module, and where you report your agency capacity building. So we're going to call out some trends we've seen and some things that you can look out for. Again, the screenshots are pulled from SmartForms, but if you're using a state system, it might not look exactly like this, but you might have similar checks built in. So one of the most popular, I guess, flag that we usually see is that previous year comparison. We do compare module 2 data to the previous year. And the main reason that that check exists is, again, just to make sure that we're catching instances where the data might have accidentally been entered incorrectly, right? So if we notice that there's a really big variance from a previous year, then the SmartForm flags it for us, and it flags it yellow, right? So we have color coding built in, and that just lets us know, okay, well, it looks like this is significantly higher or significantly lower than the previous year. Let's just take another look at it, right? And that's really what these flags and checks are for. Let's take another look at it and make sure that the data is in fact correct before we finalize that data. So the majority of checks that you get in module 2 are going to be those previous year checks. And they're going to show up in the expenditures, in the allocated resources, because those really are some popular data points that we also are asked to report on as a network. So we really want to make sure that those data points are as accurate as possible. Another thing that you want to be on the lookout for is, if you notice on the example on screen, you'll notice that this agency seems to be reporting a lot in services supporting multiple domains. Nothing wrong with that. An agency can report that there if that is where they believe that their expenditures must fit in. We would just ask all states to work with your agencies to make sure that that is the case, that those funds really cannot be categorized in any other category. And the main reason for that, right, is because at the end of the day, why do we collect data? We collect it to tell a story. And, if the majority of funds go into services supporting multiple domains, we just lose some of the nuance in the story we're telling if at the end of the day we're saying, well, all of this money was spent on services that supported multiple domains, right? So, just for the sake of trying to make sure that we are telling as detailed of a story as possible, you do want to keep an eye out for that data point. And at the end of the day, it is fine if that is where the expenditures truly fit, then that is where they should go. Another common issue that we notice is, for example, what you see on screen, 8.3 is blank. That means that the agency did not report any administrative dollars. Again, that could be the case. The agency may not have used any CSBG funds on administrative expenses. But, again, we flag it just because the purpose of the flag is to draw your attention and just double check, right? That's what the flag does. So you just want to double check and make sure, that the agency didn't accidentally leave that blank, and that if they did use CSBG dollars for administrative purposes, that does in fact get reported here, because again, that's part of the story, right? Another common issue that you want to keep an eye out for as you're reviewing the data is, for example, this agency reported funds in agency capacity building. That's that A.2I data field. They said we spent $2,348 in agency capacity building. This goes back to that issue on completeness I mentioned earlier. So if they said we expended funds, CSBG funds on agency capacity building, when they come to 8.4, they should talk about what those funds were spent on. Was it spent on the needs assessment, on the strategic planning, on data management, on TNTA, or other? They have an opportunity to write about whatever they want to in that other, to describe what they use the funds on for agency capacity building. And again, that's because it helps us tell a more nuanced story, right? When we can talk about the investment that we're making into our agency. So you want to make sure that you're checking for that level of completeness. Moving on into section B. So that is really it for section A. Moving on into section B, this is the agency capacity building section of module 2. So the section starts off by talking about hours of agency capacity building. That's hours that board members spend and hours that agency staff spent in those kinds of activities. And of course, if it flags yellow, that means you just want to double check it with the previous year to make sure that that number wasn't entered in incorrectly, right? So that's just what a previous year check means. Then in B.3, that's where agencies report volunteer hours. So the total number of volunteer hours that were donated to that agency. And then B.3A1 is a subset of that. So it's of the above, the total number of volunteer hours that were donated by individuals with low income specifically. So if you're taking a look at the example, you might be noticing something, right? It looks like the agency is reporting the exact same amount for the total number of volunteer hours and then the number of volunteer hours by low-income people specifically. And again, can that be possible? Absolutely. It can be possible that all of the agency's volunteers were low income, but, you know, a lot of times we haven't necessarily noticed where every single volunteer is low income, right? So you just want to double check for that to make sure that the agency didn't accidentally just copy the exact same number without meaning to, right? And just to make sure that that B3A1 is really a subset. We have seen instances where it has exceeded the total number of volunteer hours. And in that case, that would be a logic error, right? Like we cannot have a subset exceeding what the total is supposed to be. You don't see it on screen, but in those instances that would highlight red. And usually if things are red, that means there's just sort of a logical error happening here that shouldn't be happening here. So most likely those instances will absolutely have to be addressed. So that's section B. Moving on to section, there's one more part in section B. B.5 is where agencies report, it's on the next slide. B.5 is where agencies report the number of organizations that they're partnering with. And so in this example, the state government, they've reported 0. And then for statewide associations, they've reported 0. Well, with the exception of, I think, 1 or maybe 2 states that don't have a state association, right? The majority of the states do have a state association that the agencies are partnered with, right? So because all agencies are in partnership with you guys as the state office, right? This is all a partnership. They should be listing you as one, at least for that state government partnership. And then if there is a state association, which there is in the majority of cases, they should at least be listing their state association as partners there. So those are just some things to look out for there. Okay, so we didn't highlight section C because section C is just the only thing there, I think, is just some previous year checks that we do there. So no outstanding trends that we've noticed in section C of module 2. So that was, you know, module 2 generally speaking. And now we're going to talk about the CARES and disaster module 2 specifically. So in the CARES and Disaster Module 2, we have added a couple new data points. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye out on those data points to make sure that they're being reported on accurately. But the biggest thing with the CARES and disaster reports is that they are subsets of the regular report, right? So again, just like I mentioned in one specific data point, a subset can never exceed what is the total there, right? So just keep that in mind as we go over some of the trends that we've seen in CARES and disaster. So first up, one of the new data points that was added to the CARES and Disaster Administrative Module 2 was 8.2. So you want to be careful, the numbering schema is different for the CARES and disaster forms versus the regular forms. But we added a data point called 8.2, and that is where agencies are reporting the amount of their CARES supplemental or disaster supplemental that was allocated to that agency. And one of the biggest trends that we noticed as we were doing the review for fiscal year 20 data is notice what you see on screen. This agency is reporting $33,957 in 8.2, but that number matches exactly what they're reporting in their expenditures. Again, could it be possible that the agency just expended all of their allocation and that is why that number is matching in fiscal year 20? Sure. But what we've noticed a lot of times is that it seems like agencies are actually just reporting their expenditure in 8.2 instead of their allocation. So as a state office, you definitely want to double check to make sure that your agencies are reporting their allocation in 8.2, not their expenditures. Moving on. So along with that train of thought, you do want to compare 8.2 in the CARES and Disaster Module 2 to C.2 in the CARES and Disaster Module 2. So 8.2 is asking agencies to report their allocation, but C.2 is also asking agencies to report the allocation. The difference, as OCS has gone over at multiple times in previous webinars, is that in C.2, you can also include previous year carryover and discretionary. You do not include carryover and discretionary in 8.2. So the two don't have to match, but they're probably going to be a little similar, right? So again, going back to this example, right, where the agency reported 33,000, and then you look at their C.2 and you notice, oh, they're actually reporting, $289,000 for their allocation. Well, that's sort of a big hint to you that maybe they're reporting their expenditures in 8.2 instead of their allocation, right? So that's why you just want to make sure that you're doing that comparison to just confirm that your agency is in fact reporting allocations in 8.2, not expenditures. Next slide. So for reporting, we've been asked this question from multiple different states. This is a very frequently asked question. OCS has addressed it in previous webinars, but we're bringing it up again because repetition is the game here. And this is something that US state offices should be looking for in your agency's forms, right? So unless you're a small state and you got a separate allocation, 8.2 should stay the same for your agencies from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21, right? The exception is just for small states. If you're not a small state, your agencies should not be changing what they report in 8.2. So that will be one thing you need to check for. C.2 will, again, that's where agencies report carryover and discretion in fiscal year 21. So with small states, they got another allocation, so they would be reporting that here. But if you're not a small state and you did not get a new CARES allocation, your fiscal year 21 C.2 shouldn't really exceed the fiscal year 20 C.2, right? If you didn't get more allocations there. So the example we have on screen is, let's say in fiscal year 20, an agency got $100,000. That was their allocation. And they spent $40,000 of that in their expenditures. In fiscal year 21, 8.2, they should still report that $100,000, right? But in C.2, they're going to report the carryover, what's left of that, and plus if they got any discretionary, right? But we're just going to keep it a simple example for now. We're just going to report the carryover, which is $60,000. So I hope that that clears it up for a lot of states on here. Next slide. So the other thing I mentioned earlier, which is that the CARES and disaster is a subset of the regular report, right? The module 2 is a subset of the regular module 2. The module 4 is a subset of the regular module 4. Now, even if you're using smart forms, we have zero way of doing checks between separate files, right? Because your CARES module 2 is an entirely separate file from your regular module 2. They're two different smart forms, and we have no way of building in logic that checks the both against each other. So this is an instance in which, regardless if you're a state system or if you're a smart form user, this is an instance in which you actually just have to check for this manually yourself. No programming is going to help you check this. Unless you built in programming in your state system, which would be awesome, but for the majority, I think you're just going to have to sort of eyeball this yourself. So you want to check the CARES and disaster module 2 against your regular module 2 with the logic that no data point in CARES module 2 or in disaster module 2 should ever exceed what is reported in the regular module 2. So let's take a look at an example. In this example, you know, the right side is showing the CARES, and for those who use smart forms, you'll know that visually because the CARES is a boring black and white form, but the regular module 2 is more colorful. So on the right side, that's the CARES form. This agency is reporting $20,000 in the housing domain. Okay, well, let's take a look at their regular form. Oh, look, they reported $20,000 in housing. Great, you know, we could presume that the $20,000 they're reporting in their regular report is all from that CARES, right? Let's take a look at what else they're reporting in their CARES. They're reporting $13,957 in services supporting multiple domains. Let's take a look at their regular form. Oh no, we don't see any dollars in services supporting multiple domains, right? And the regular report needs to include all of your CSBG and disaster expenditures, right? So you can't have zero reported in your regular report in a domain if there was in fact something reported there. And in this case, you know, we're going with the example that they reported nothing in the regular report, but let's say they reported $1,000 in the regular report for services supporting multiple domains. That data is still not correct because they're still reporting more in the subset, which is the CARES, as opposed to the regular report, which should include everything. So you as state offices, I know it's going to be challenging because we are working with lots of different forms and reports right now, but it is really important that we try to do that extra step and try to compare the two and make sure that the data is making logical sense, right? Because if we're going to say the CARES data is a subset of the regular, but then we have instances where the CARES is actually exceeding the regular, that just won't make sense, right? So please, please, please do check for those things. Whenever you do get your review memos, you'll probably notice a lot of comments focused on this. You might, you know, sometimes, you know, we'll point out instances where things have exceeded. Other times we're just asking you to confirm because we may not be able to tell from the data. So all we're doing is to double check that the regular report does include everything from the CARES. Next slide. One of those new fields I talked about that was added to the CARES and Disaster Administrative Module 2 was 8.6. 8.6 does not exist in the regular report. It is only in CARES and Disaster. And this is your agency's opportunity to tell more about their story on what they use those funds for, right? Especially because we know a lot of CARES and Disaster funds were used for agency capacity purposes, right? Or they were used for purposes that can't necessarily be neatly packed into an NPI or service, right? So this is the opportunity for your agencies to tell that story of what they did there. And as state offices, you should review 8.6 for, any examples you pull of CARES activities, and to just give you a better understanding of what your agencies have been spending their CARES funds on. So that's really it for 8.6, and that's it for section A of the CARES and disaster. There is no section B, so we're going to move on to section C in the CARES and disaster. Same logic. This is a subset of the regular form. You want to compare the two against each other, and you will have to sort of just do that manually on your end, because unfortunately, they're two separate forms, so they don't speak to each other. But same thing here, right? So if they reported an allocation in CARES and disaster, that should never exceed whatever allocation they reported in the regular. So when we look at the example on screen, okay, so let's take a look at C.2 for their CARES, which is on the right side. They reported $289,000, great. On the left side, on the regular, they reported $347,000. Okay, that works. Why? Because they're not reporting more in their CARES than they're reporting in their total allocation in the regular report for CSBG. Sometimes you do want to check that, right? Like I've seen instances where agencies, for example, every year they get 400, maybe every year they get that $347,000 allocation, and they're reporting the exact same this year, then I might kind of wonder like, okay, well, did you actually include your CARES allocation? Like I know your CARES isn't exceeding it, but did you still include it? And it's still worth double checking at times. Let's take a look at another example on screen. So their line heap. In the CARES, go back one more slide, thank you. On their CARES light heap, they're reporting $150,000. We take a look at, or actually they're not fully aligned. So on their CARES, on the regular light heap, they're reporting 600,000. That's fine, that works. Let's take a look at another example. Early Head Start, they're reporting $350,000. Let's take a look at their regular Head Start. Oh, look, they're not reporting anything for Early Head Start in the regular report, and that would be incorrect, because if they said they got $350,000 in CARES, that should also be reported in the regular report. So they should have at least $350,000 reported in the regular report. So again, you just want to make sure that the two reports are telling the same story. And with that, that is it for Module 2, the administrative module, and what you should look out for. Any other questions? I don't see them. So Paige is going to walk us through Module 4, the individual and family level report.
Thank you, Muska. Yes. So before we jump into Module 4, individual and family considerations, we want to discuss some key points for understanding the Fmpis and the outcomes in this section. So we can go to the next slide. So as a reminder, we have outcomes, which are the results a program attends to achieve, and the goal of the program. And then we have indicators, which are the means of measuring change and progress toward those goals and those outcomes. So there can be several indicators working together to achieve an outcome. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. So for example, if the goal is to improve financial well-being, what does that mean? It could involve improving credit scores, increasing savings, purchasing an asset. All of these would be indicators that are measuring progress towards that overall outcome of financial well-being. And then we can go to the next slide. So the other part of Module 4 is services. So services are the activities that are carried out to achieve those outcomes I just mentioned. So services should be related to an indicator so that they can be connected to needs and outcomes. However, not all services will lead to an outcome, which is okay. And then we can go to the next slide. So this is what I mentioned earlier. You can see there's a combination of various services LIHEAP services, parenting support, and transportation services that are all coming together, adding up to ultimately achieve the outcome, FNPI 3A, of meeting basic needs for 90 days. So those are kind of how those can work together. And then on the next slide, we've talked a little bit about outcomes, but what do you use to know that an outcome is achieved? We use measurement tools. So a lot of agencies will use pre and post tests, proof from documents like paycheck stubs and things like that. So some of the more common ones are listed here, and that's what agencies use to ensure that the FNPIs are achieved. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so if your state uses smart forms, this will look familiar to you. This is the Outstanding Errors and Warnings tab. So this tab is really helpful for states. When you're doing your review, you can utilize this list to address any errors and warnings, and it's part of the review checklist to go through this list and make sure everything that needs to be addressed is addressed. And then we can go to the next slide. Let's go mention this earlier, but we want to check out that, keep an eye out for incompleteness. So like these red highlights, you want to make sure that that those are complete and all filled out. And then on the next slide, another thing to look out for is the relationship between participants served and services. So on the left, you can see are the FNPIs, and column 1 is showing the number of participants served. So you want to compare that column to the actual services in the same domain. So these are both for the employment domain. And you can see that column 1 is showing people being served, but there's not really much alignment in the actual services section. There's mostly like zeros across the board. So you want to watch out for that, and also watch out for the reverse, where you see a lot of services being reported in the services section, but not under the FNPI. And then on the next slide, there are some age-specific indicators in the FNPI. So some of them are specific to children, some are for seniors. So we want to compare the number being served and obtaining outcomes to the services and demographics in the other sections of Module 4. So here we can see in column 3, they're saying like 5,000 children achieved improved literacy skills, but there were like 0 people served. So that doesn't really make sense here. So that would be something to keep an eye out for, as well as the reverse. If you're seeing like 5,000 people were served, but 0 achieved the outcome, that would also want to be addressed. We look at the next slide. So we just saw that in FNPIs, there were 5,000 children, 0 to 5, that were reported as achieving Head Start outcomes. But when we look at services, we're not seeing anyone reported there. It's all zeros. So that would be something to address, as well as when we look at the section C, which is the demographic section, the children aged 0 to 5, there's only like a little under 600 of them. So they're not being reported there either. So that would be something to keep an eye out for as well. And can we go to the next slide? So FNPI 7A, this is one that gets flagged a lot. This indicator is outcomes across multiple domains. It's in the last section of section A, and it reports the unduplicated count of people who have received 1 or more outcomes in any of the domains. So anyone who achieves at least one outcome should be reported here. But remember, it is an unduplicated count, which I think Muska will talk about unduplicated count more in a little bit, but this is an unduplicated count. So even if they achieved a ton of different outcomes, they're only reported here once. And then can we go to the next slide? Okay, so again, this is Fmpi 7A. You see the picture at the bottom. It was reported that 342 people achieved one or more outcomes. But then when we look at the top section, we see that can't be right, because looking at their education domain outcomes here at the top, we see that 1,229 achieved school readiness. So that Fmpi 7A has to be at least as high as 1,229, because we know at least that many people achieved one outcome. And can we go to the next section? So this is the demographics. So we just want to point out to make sure that all the totals, each line that says total, those should add up to item A if it's for individuals, and they should add up to item B if it's for households. But military status and the work status sections, those should only add up to individuals who are 18 and over, because there are no children in the military status and the work status sections. All right, I think that wraps up module 4, and we are over to you, Muska.
Thanks, Paige. So let's just make a note about unduplicated counts. Again, a reminder, moving on to the next slide, please, that everything in the report is supposed to be an unduplicated count, right? So that just means it's an actual count of individuals, or if, you know, their demographics, households, whatever it is, where that unit is only counted one time, right? So to the best of your ability, you want to try to make sure that you're getting an unduplicated count there. So this really comes up in services. So moving on to the next slide, the services really should be an unduplicated count of people. That is what the report has been set up for. The column up top says unduplicated number of individuals served, right? So this really should be a count of those people that are served instead. And so, you know, a lot of times we'll see instances where in service 5II, for example, prepared meals, you know, usually if you see a really big number like 100,000, that's probably a hint to you at the state office that the agency is reporting the service, right? As opposed to an unduplicated count of the people that are receiving that service. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. Again, we completely understand there are data, you know, barriers and challenges, but to the best of your ability, this is what the intent of this report is to get an unduplicated count of people. So that's really it on unduplicated counts. And then just to wrap up some sort of final things to review for, oh, sorry, I forgot about cares and disaster, of course, very important. So in module 4, you know, of course, we have a section on services and the regular report. And then for the cares and disaster module 4, the individual and family level report, agencies are only reporting their services there. No NPIs, no demographics in the cares and disaster. Same mindset as module 2. The cares and disaster are supposed to be subsets of the regular, which means every dollar that gets reported in cares should get reported in the regular. When we talk about module 4, every service that gets reported in cares or disaster, that should be reported in regular. So for example, notice over here, we're noticing where this agency down below is the CARES example, up top is regular. And the CARES example, they reported 4,500 people that received food boxes, right? But when you look at the regular report, they have 0 people receiving food boxes. Again, that cannot be logically true because they should be reporting everything in the regular. So if they're reporting 4,500 people in the CARES having received food boxes, they should be reporting that in the regular report as well. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, the services reported in the CARES and Disaster Supplemental also should not exceed the total people served in the regular report. And I know this is a bit tricky. We're not asking for demographics in the CARES and Disaster report specifically, but in the regular report, the agency is reporting everything, right? So when they're reporting their demographics in the regular report, that's presumably all of the demographics for that agency, right? So even in the regular report, right, at no point, well, I know there are data barrier issues, I hear you guys, but in theory, right, we shouldn't have a data point in the NPIs or the services that exceeds the total number of people reported in the demographics, right? So when we say 100,000 meals, right, or 100,000 people receive meals, that doesn't necessarily make logical sense if you're saying you only serve 30,000 people total at the agency, right? Similar thing for the CARES and disaster services. In this example, you know, they reported 65,000 people receiving meals. You know, if we compare that to the services in the regular report, we might not see an issue because that number does not exceed what they're reporting in the regular. Okay, so the regular has 100,000, the CARES has 65,000, so we're good there. But when you compare the 65,000 to demographics again, then it doesn't make sense, because how are we serving 65,000 with meals if we're saying the total number of people served were 30,000? So again, these are some of the manual checks you want to do as an agency or as a state office for your agency's data. Next slide. And then I think it's not on here.
Really quick before we go on to that, I did want to just mention one thing about this example. We have not been flagging 5I, 5II, or 5JJ. But this is something that we've noticed quite often, where the numbers reported here are exceeding the total unduplicated number of all individuals. So this is something that we will be touching on more in the future, because this is supposed to be an unduplicated amount of individuals served. So if Susan is receiving a prepared meal every week, she would still only be counted once and not 52 times because she received a prepared meal each week. So just something to be thinking about as you're reporting this information, as your eligible entities. We're not going to flag it for 2020, but it is something that we are going to start talking more about and delving more into in upcoming years.
So we have tools and resources, which Paige can walk us through, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Sure. So can we go to the next slide? All of our resources, if you go to nascast.org and then go to CSBG and then data collection and reporting and CSBG annual report, or just use that link right there. That'll take you to all of our resources. There's the annual report Lexicon, which is essentially a dictionary of like key terms and everything that are useful for reporting. And the module 2 through 4 checklists are on there that will help you in your review. And also, I believe there's resources on there for module 3, reviewing that as well. So those are the main ones we wanted to point out. Thank you.
Thank you again, Paige and Muska. We have about 15 minutes left in this webinar. This is one of our longer webinars because we knew we had a lot of content to share with everyone. But we are coming towards the Q&A. So just as we're going through over some of our contacts, please make sure to add any questions that you guys have to the Q&A section. Just as a reminder, your OCS program specialists are Lindsay, Jamia, Andrew, Catherine, and Judith. You can see which regions they serve on the screen, as well as their email address and their phone numbers. Please copy csbgstates@acf.hhs.gov on all emails. This just helps us to ensure that we received your email and that we're giving you a prompt response. Nikki and I serve as your ODC technical assistants. Ooh, there's an issue there, but I'll fix it. And we will answer any questions that you guys have with OLDC, including uploading the smart form, the XMLs, as well as submitting your Module 1 annual reports and Module 3. And then again, thank you, Muska and Paige, for joining us. Please feel free to reach out to them with any questions about the content shared in today's slides, as well as reaching out to them in regards to any smart form related issues. And now we will go to questions. So the first question that we have that I'll answer really quickly is, are we going to share the slides? Yes, we will be sharing the slides. They should be available within the next 24 to 48 hours. We just have to do a quick 508 compliance and then get them loaded onto the webinar page. So Muska, this will go to you. Will you see a direction note to coincide with the yellow flag?
So in Module 2, I don't think we built in like those directions, those Excel direction notes that come up, but in Module 4, you will see a couple instances where those come up. But if you ever, if you're using a smart form and you notice something highlighted yellow or red, it will always show up in your outstanding errors and warnings tab. So that's where you want to go to see what the direction is there.
We were also asked, will we still need to provide justification for the flagged items? Muska, do you mind answering this one?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to answer it, combining it with another question that asks, shouldn't the agency check the outstanding errors and warnings first? Absolutely. This is all a team effort. The agency should be checking their outstanding errors and warnings first before they submit it to you guys. You should be checking your agency's errors and warnings before you submit to OCS. And when you do that review, right? So we talked a lot about the things you should look out for, but we didn't really talk about process. So that's a great question. When you do that review and you look at these things, you have some process of communicating that back with your agencies, right? And you might need to ask your agencies for clarification. We did share a comments template that you can use. It is not mandatory for you to use it, but that's just a template. And your agencies can provide a comment explaining why the data makes sense. So there's two things that happen when you point something out to your agency. Either they realize they need to fix it, in which case they make that change and then that flag never shows up again. Great. Or, there are lots of instances, and I see it in the chat too, where people are explaining why, certain times things flag, but the data actually is correct because they didn't collect demographics information on this program. We completely understand that. So in that case, the agency would just provide an explanation saying, hey, we know this is flagging. We know this is an issue that's coming up, but this data is correct. And so in that case, you would provide that justification and attach it, upload it into OLDC. Monique and the team are going to walk through that process in another webinar. But if you provide those justifications on the front end, at the national level, we do take a look at those when we're reviewing the data so that we can not call it out again for you in your review memo.
Thank you, Muska. So I'm going to jump back to slide 20 really quick because we received this question, why is C.2 in yellow?
That is because it's for this agency, it was just popping up a previous year flag. So you're not seeing the previous year data on screen, but that's why it flagged yellow, was because the form was reading that this was very different from the previous year. That's just all that it was, but irrelevant to the example that we were sharing on that slide.
Thank you, Muska. The next question that we will answer again goes with, I cannot find the recordings for the previous webinars. I see the slides, but not the webinar recordings. As Nikki put in the chat, it does go through a clearance process at ACF. They are currently reviewing the recordings from the previous webinar, so those will get posted as soon as possible. The next question we have, I thought 8.2 is the entire CSBG Cares Award. So for small states, fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, that is correct. It is the entire CSBG Cares Award. So for those, when Muska spoke towards that, what she was saying is for the states that did not receive the extra allotment because they were a small state that was affected by the minimum and maximum allotment, they reported their full allotment last year, and they should continue to report their full allotment going forward. So it would be the same response in 8.2 for last year and this year. And that's the majority of the states. For the states that were affected by the minimum and maximum allotment, or the small states, that number is going to change because you received a second allotment in fiscal year 21. So it should be the full CSBG CARES award for fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21 for those small states. Here's another question that's in relation to CARES, Module 2, Section A. It states Module 2, Section A should not include carryover for CARES. Wouldn't the spent always be the same as allocated? And no, that's, so two things with this, and we'll try to put together like a little quick sheet or something like this. 8.2 is different for CARES, is different than it is for the regular report, which made C.2 different for CARES than it is in the regular report. In the regular report, there is not a at 8.2, which this might be something that we change in the future where we do add 8.2. The reason we added 8.2 into the CARES report is because we want to be sure how much money was actually allocated to the eligible entity that year. This is more, and for the regular report, what that would mean is, a state receives fiscal year 2021 funds, and then they allocate a portion of that to the eligible entity. And so we are starting this with the CARES report, but would implement it in the regular report in future years. We're asking, of the fiscal year 2021 allotment that the state received, how much of those fiscal year 2021 or federal fiscal year 2021 funds were allocated to eligible entity? And that is what we're asking for in 8.2 of CARES. How much of your allocation did you receive that year? Again, this is not, you don't see the major difference in 8.2, and because there is none in the regular, but for C.2, we're only asking, of that allotment you received, how much did you spend this year? So it is a little bit different. It is focused on that expenditures. C.2 is, of your allotment, how much did you spend? So for some states last year, eligible entities last year, that would have been 0 because some eligible entities were not able to expend federal CSBG, CARES dollars. And for other eligible entities, there will be an amount. So we're looking at the carryover and the amount that you were planning to expend for 2021 or did expend for 2021 in order to provide the services that you're reporting in Module 4, Section B. So this question is from Muska. If an agency has a transportation program to support employment, could you have alignment with the Fmpi employment domain with services that support multiple services domain? Should an agency make notes about that?
So great question. This is going back to that thing that Paige talked about making sure you're checking NPIs with your services and that they're telling a similar story, right? But that's just what we're saying. The numbers do not have to match exactly, nor will we ever look for exact matching between the employment services and the employment NPIs. We completely understand that some of those outcomes in the employment domain are probably not coming from employment services. They're probably coming from services supporting multiple domains, which is your transportation, your case management. We only really, I'll just say from a perspective of review, we really only ask to double check if there's a very extreme difference there. But otherwise, if an agency just happens to have a transportation program that also feeds into employment NPIs, it's fine if the numbers are not matching up exactly. If they do want to make a note of it and provide an explanation, it won't hurt just to explain that that's what's going on. But we also understand that they're not going to align exactly well, and that is fine.
So we are seeing a lot of questions about that services count exceeding the total number of persons served in demographics, as well as pulling information from the Module 4 manual. Again, we're not changing the instructions for that this year. It is something that we're pointing out because it is something that we may consider changing in the future. But it's not something we're changing this year. It is just something that we notice as we're reviewing. And in some cases, like with the example that Muska did show, And the example, it's like largely exceeding the amount of people served. And I will say from the OCS perspective, those are things that we get questions about, and it's not as easy to explain, and it causes concern for a data validity, from a data validity perspective. So that's why we're starting to point that out, but we are not changing any of the requirements as they're shown in the, as they're currently shown in the manuals for this year. Can we get the slides separately? So they will be on our website, most likely by tomorrow on the OCS webinar page. Then you'll be able to download them from there.
And I see a couple comments in the chat and the Q&A where you guys are explaining, right, that sometimes numbers exceed the demographics because the demographics doesn't contain demographics from this one program that the agency didn't collect it on. And again, we completely understand that there are going to be barriers to data collection, and that data collection is not going to be perfect. So I think what you guys just described is just that, right? When we say to review for those things, it's to double check to make sure that you understand why the data looks the way that it does, right? And so as long as you have that understanding and you know for this agency, this is why, then that is what it is, and that is fine. And that's the purpose of the data review that you conduct, is to make sure that you understand that.
So I do see a question here that we are going to hold for later. I'm going to review it after and provide a direct question. But one last question that we have is C.2 CARES. Did I just hear correctly? It is only CARES expended during fiscal year 21. I understood that our agency should report fiscal year 21 CARES allocation and CSBG CARES and discretionary. So in C.2, we're only looking at carryover and discretionary, not for CARES.
So for them, they're a small state, so I think they're talking about like the new allocation that they received also.
That should still not be included. It should be essentially your carryover and allocation for if you're reporting on the federal fiscal year as an eligible entity, it should be what their carryover and allocation for October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. So we're looking for that amount within that fiscal year. If it's a state, if they're reporting based on the state fiscal year, it's not the July 1st through June 30th, and if it's calendar year, January 1st through, because what you received, and essentially we're looking at how you're spending the funds throughout the 3 year that you have the amount that you have that money to spend, if that makes sense. I will make sure that we put a little slide in one of our next presentations to kind of explain that visually, but yes, C.2 and A.2 shouldn't necessarily be the same, but C.2 should not exceed A.2. But we'll make sure that we put that in an image to better describe that. So we did get a question, what is a small state? I've heard this term before, but I'm not sure it is. I do not have the DCL pulled up in front of me, but the small state is a state that was affected by the minimum maximum allotment. I will say if you're not sure what that term means, that you're probably not considered one of the small states. We do have a DCL that kind of describes what that is. There was a group of states that were affected when we started to allocate CARES funds because they had exceeded the minimum maximum allotment that is allowed during the that is allowed to states within a fiscal year. So we will try to get you that DCL so you can see it, but if you're not familiar with exactly what a small state is, then you're probably not part of the small states group. And yes, for the final question, C2 allocated, not expended, that is accurate. No, C.2 is not allocated, not expended. It is, I will make sure we put in a visual because I do not want to cause any more confusion for people. So we'll make sure that we put that in a visual in either the 16th or the 17th webinar. And with that, I'm going to, because we do only have about 1 minute left. So I just want to remind everyone the importance of Module 3. We haven't gone into depth in any of these webinars, but just a reminder, it is optional. There's only one form, so you would only report on it as part of your regular CSBG annual report. This is described in CSBG DCL 2021-04, and there is more information and guidance in our CSBG Dear Colleague Letter 2020-14, as well as the Module 3 Instruction Manual. Again, these slides will be available within 24 to 48 hours on the OCS webinar webpage, so you'll be able to click those links to access those pieces of guidance. And just a reminder, we have 2 more webinars in this series, the Smart Forms Refresher and the OLDC Refresher. They're both scheduled for next week, February 16th at 3 p.m. and February 17th at 3:30 p.m. We hope that you're able to join us. The links to register are on our website, and we will be sending out announcements as a reminder to everyone. We just want to thank you. And again, thank you, Muska and Paige, for joining us on this webinar today. And yes, I will back up what Denise is saying in the comments. NCAP sees Module 3 is cleared, critical. So does OCS. We do encourage you to encourage your CAAs to complete. Even though we haven't been sharing information, we do look at Module 3, and we have been using it to answer some questions about the type of community level transformations we're doing at the community level. So we are still using the data, even though we haven't done anything at the national level with it or publicly. So we are getting questions and we are using it. So it is very, very important and it's very, very critical. So please encourage your CAAs to complete, but it is not required.
And of course, NASCASP echoes that sentiment. It is incredibly important, your agency's opportunity to tell the story there. So I just wanted to thank OCS again for having us, and to thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. You guys have been doing great work. This is teamwork. We are moving ahead one step at a time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.